My cousin and I booked a 5-day trip to our grandparents' old house when it listed on Airbnb. And for some reason, I just couldn't shake this restlessness ever since I saw the confirmation email. We packed up the car, and my husband asked if I wanted him to come up with us. We packed up the car, and my husband asked if I wanted him to come up with us. I said no, it was something my cousin wanted us to do together. I knew he hadn't taken the time off, and with work deadlines, he'd been doing himself a disservice to go hang out in not even a cool place for the week. I told him traveling made me nervous, and it was true. It did, being far away from home, away from my stuff, made the distance feel even farther. The trip was long, but pretty uneventful. We left really early in the morning, about 5:30 a.m., and got there around 4:30 p.m. Everything from the highway onwards was almost the same. The last 20 years hadn't really changed anything in this old town. The long road that led to the property was miles and miles long, with small homes nestled deep in off the main road. The area was still predominantly very wild. We didn't see a single person out besides 2 trucks when we first turned on, leaving the shadowy area behind. As we pulled into the driveway, all the memories I had created there with my family came flooding back. The ugly, speckled hallway I ran down as a child, knocking on every door, waking everyone up on the weekends. The stone fireplace in the back living room where my grandfather laid plastic so the couches were never really set on. The small pantry area where the washer and dryer barely fit, and when it got too hot would melt any chocolate in the room. We spent the next 30-40 minutes just wandering around, reminiscing. I walked into my great-grandmother's old room I remember watching Law and Order all night in. The dramatic bedroom furniture, African-themed, was gone and replaced by a dresser and a queen-sized bed. It was a different room meant for a different life. He sat in his old bedroom alone for a bit. The same room that my grandfather died in years later was the room he grew up in. I guess it was that type of trip for him. I could hear him quietly crying in his room, and I knew I wouldn't be seeing much of him for the rest of the night. After a while, I heard his light snores, and as the rain came, of course, he snored louder. I could hear him snoring across the hall and knew I wouldn't be able to sleep with the noises. I left my sleeping pills at home, figuring I'd be passed out from all the driving and bonding. Work stress was the reason I didn't sleep well to begin with, and for the next week I wasn't going to be doing any work. It was cold for October, and the rain made it even colder. The house grew icy as it got later and later, and I thought it would be fun to light the fireplace. I had only lit it a few times as a kid, and I remembered how cool it was. I sat in the back living room reading a book on my phone. My back to the wraparound porch, the fire burning small on the few logs I added. The fire burned, and it started to get smoky pretty quickly in the living room. I put the fire out but was still stuck in this smoky room. I reached over to open a window behind me and stopped before I pulled the shade up. There was a shadow on the outside of the room, just a small sliver of something. I slid down the couch slowly onto the floor, kicking myself. I'm an adult. I slid down the couch slowly onto the floor, kicking myself. I'm an adult. Why would I be afraid of a small shadow? But still, I didn't move or breathe. I stood up quickly, realizing I wasn't 10 anymore, and the shadow on the bottom of the window was gone. I looked around the room, not wanting to turn on a light, and saw the crank for the outside vent. I turned it open. I looked around the room, not wanting to turn on a light, and seeing the crank for the outside vent, I turned it open and let the smoke out. I was thankful I didn't have to open the window. But what was outside the window? What was leaning against it? Why was it there? Why was I here again? My cousin's snores reminded me. Oh yeah, him. Our grandfather died when I was a kid and he was a teenager. My cousin was obsessed with my grandfather and took it the hardest when he found out he was sick. The day he died, the only day my cousin had taken for himself in months, was the day my grandfather passed. In the few moments he was alone, he was gone. My cousin had been plagued by guilt. And no matter how many times we told him cancer killed our grandfather, he blamed himself. I eventually went to sleep across the hall from him. I preferred the proximity to the annoying snores. I watched the window until I couldn't keep my eyes up, expecting to see a shadow moving against the outside window. In the morning, we went to the small kitchen for breakfast, realizing that the window treatments our grandmother had installed were removed for a more modern look. It removed privacy as well. We saw hundreds of thick old trees, decades and decades old. I thought about how much they'd seen, wishing they could talk to us. While we sat and ate, I didn't want to tell him about the shadow. It sounds stupid saying it now. There were animals outside. It sounded stupid saying it now. There were animals outside, he'd agree. So I let it go, and we were focused on chatting and catching up and looking around. We walked around the property, talking about our family and all the fun we had as kids. My idea, of course, was to see if I could see anything that could have been explained the night before. There wasn't much, but right under the porch awning, in the dirt, I saw an impression of a large paw print. My cousin saw it and said it looked like a bear print, but I didn't see anything like that. Bear prints don't look like huge dog prints. We shrugged it off and drove to the grocery store a few miles away. The small store was pretty empty. We recognized the butcher, and our cashier was my grandparents' old neighbor growing up. The woman was older than dirt when I was a child and still looked as ancient as ever. She recognized my cousin and knew me by name. She asked what we were doing here and how we had been, and we told her we were renting out our grandparents' house for the week. She looked really surprised. "The old Hawkins house," she said again. She said. We nodded. There was no other house. She said there had been a lot of issues in the woods around that area for years. My grandparents' property had been sold and purchased over and over again. Already 5 different people she's introduced herself to. One day, some contractors came in and did some work, and the house sat for 5 years. She moved shortly after that, when her goats were ripped apart in her backyard pen and her chickens killed for the 3rd time that year. She was old. She raised a few small goats for the company, and it was awful to have to clean up their dead, mangled bodies. She said an old man had hit something coming down the road a few years back, really, really late one of those days when the trees and the clouds ate up the moon. What he hit looked like a tall, muscular bear, but furrier. It limped off into the woods and was gone before he could get out of the drive. The car was totaled. Hair and blood covered the hood. He was talking in circles when the police came. The next few years had been rough for everyone on the road. Apparently, the town was dying. Poverty, drugs, and animals being killed on this road had sadly become normal. We were shaken when we left the store, and I thought about my own encounter in the woods behind their house when I was a kid. When I was going to mention it to my cousin, he started to tell me about his own encounter. He said his friends had been drinking and smoking at my grandparents' house one week and they were away. My aunt and uncle were pretty strict, so watching the house really meant to get high and a little buzzed with friends in the woods nowhere near the house. They had dragged a picnic table a few hundred yards back into the woods so they wouldn't be visible or able to be smelled from the road in case anyone stopped by. They set it up with a few camping lanterns and relaxed. It was barely 5:30, but with the thick trees, it was as dark as the night. They had been out there for a few hours and were having fun and laughing, making fun of their friend Mark for waiting till marriage. The forest went quiet, like she was waiting for someone else to speak, and they all felt like they were being watched all of a sudden. The guys who had been laying on the ground and leaning against the trees moved closer to the lanterns and all sat huddled together on the same side of the table. They listened and heard nothing but their own heartbeats screaming in their ears. They were all afraid. My cousin told them they should go back inside, but none of them wanted to get away from the table. They sat there in silence, and eventually the noise came back to the forest. They finished their beers and ran towards the house as fast as they could. My cousin said he stayed behind and cleaned up some. It was only a few hundred yards from the house. If he moved his head back and forth, he could kind of make out where the house should have been. He cleaned up the bottles and collected the lanterns the idiots ran through the forest without. And then he heard the crunching sounds in the distance, birds' wings flapping in the air, and looked around. Nothing was there that he saw, but the lights only illuminated about 10 feet around him. He was annoyed his friends left him, but he was 17 and the rifle he always took into the woods was at his side. He started to turn back and head towards the house when he saw something run behind him near the cave. He thought it was one of his friends and called for them to stop. The crunching kept on, but it sounded fuller and louder. He grabbed the gun, dropped the bag of bottles, and bolted for the house. As he turned back towards the cave to see if he was being followed, something stood up a bit, still hunched over besides the cave entrance, 30 or 40 feet from where they were sitting. He ran quickly and ran face first into one of his friends. After he hadn't been back in a few minutes, they felt bad and came back. My cousin said he couldn't explain, he just got up and ran home past them. They all hit the back door panting, looking scared, but not really sure of what. My cousin finally calmed down after his friends gave him a beer, and he sat there still holding his gun, shaking, talking about a huge dog-like creature he saw out there. He rubbed his palms hard on his jeans as we sat in the parking lot. Once we got back to the house, the color in his face came back, and he wondered if the table and weed and bags were still back there. Once we got back to the house, the color in his face came back, and he wondered if all of their things were still back there. It was bright and sunny. The trees had thinned some for the upcoming winter, so we could see pretty deep into the forest. Once he mentioned an old pocket knife he thought he may have dropped that my grandfather gave him. I finally gave in, and we trekked back there. The table was there, and fragments of broken bottles remained. We stood out there staring at his teenage mess when we saw the cave, and he motioned for me to come over. It was right there, he pointed. Sort of crouched down, he stood beside the cave, and the side of the entrance came up to almost his shoulder. It was huge, I thought. He moved away frowning. The smile he had faded. We started to walk back home and heard a crunching and breaking sound of branches in the background. We turned, but saw nothing. I had a ball in the pit of my stomach, and I walked quickly back over the white fence, and we got inside. I was kind of angry at him. He wanted us to go back into the woods, to go back into that nightmare. I can't help but think of whatever was out there on the porch just the night before. Was it what he saw? What that man hit? We ordered dinner from a Thai restaurant a town over and ate it in the kitchen as the sun went down. The rain started up again and the house grew colder by the minute. The insulation was something that hadn't been messed with. A wind sound and breeze in the kitchen cooled our coffee, and my cousin went looking for the draft. He pulled the cord for the ladder that led to the attic and saw that there was a hole behind where the fireplace was, covered by a black sheet. He knocked on the ceiling right near where the wood had been broken and moved carefully on the plants in the middle of the floor. He saw the outside of the forest. There had been pieces of boards torn off and scratches on the inside of the wall. It looked like dried dark blood or ink, and shells littered the floor, dust piled over them, and sleeping bag-looking cloth sacks were in a far corner hidden. Books, candles, jugs of water were up there. He got down quickly and brought back a casing. He told me what he saw, and I don't know what to say. I told him about what Miranda and I saw when we were kids, what was outside the window, and what ran past me outside. For a second, I thought it was a dog, but it was so dark that night. I only looked for a second. I was on the ground, hiding in the bushes. We finished eating and grabbed a few beers as we sat in the living room, saying nothing. In between the rain pounding and the wind howling, we heard a small whimpering outside. Little yelps and barks told us it was a dog or a puppy trapped out in the rain. People often dump their pets out along this road, so we both grabbed our raincoats and ran outside. It was hard to see much. It was rainy and stormy. The barking was high-pitched and demanding. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere. We ran past the benches and the caves. We watched them fade as we listened for the puppy's cries. It had to be a puppy. The sound was so loud, and then suddenly we found what was making it, as the sounds changed to a higher pitched whine. It turned out the dog creature looked like a creepy old dog, but upright. Its dark hair was plastered to its dog head. It looked like a cross between a Doberman and the werewolves from the underworld. The creature stopped making the sound. It got what it wanted. We were out there. More of it was concealed by the trees and the darkness. My cousin pulled out a gun from his jacket and fired at it. It screamed a guttural noise and ran, and we ran towards the house. We were back inside in just a few minutes as we ran faster than we ever had. I cried once we were safe, and he handed me the gun and grabbed another from his lockbox. He had come with a lot of ammo and another gun. I sat the gun beside me, and it fell heavy on the ground. What in the world was that? I asked him. Did you come here to kill it? Why bring me along? Miranda's sister told me what had happened to you guys. It let you go. It let me go, too. When it came around, all the bad things started. We have to kill it, was all he said. He ran out into the night again, leaving the porch door wide open. I closed it and started to pack. I was annoyed that we had made ourselves at home everywhere because there were clothes, snacks, shoes, all over the place. I packed us all up and held the gun at my side and looked around the side of the door. I could see the car, but the whole side of the house I couldn't see. I sat in the car in the reverse position, ready for anything. After a few minutes, the rain was starting to slow down, and I heard my cousin calling my name. I debated on what I should do. I put my head out the window and screamed "car" over and over. I saw him coming from around the house, his head bleeding. He was shooting his gun that had run out of bullets, and I took it away from him as soon as he got inside the car. He reversed the car hard and ran through the wet grass, leaving an angry, muddy tire print all the way down the road. We headed for the highway as he cried beside me. I could see something moving in the woods, and it went from 45 to 70 quickly. We drove for hours and didn't stop until Georgia. We grabbed breakfast at McDonald's and sat in their dark parking lot. As soon as we parked, he asked if we could get back on the road. He asked to drive, but his hands were shaking, and I didn't want him driving in his condition. He said when he left the house, he knew it would be at the cave, and when we went inside, it wasn't there. He sat at the dark back of the cave to get out of the rain when he saw a small creature run past the entrance. It looked like a puppy, but the proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long, and it kind of looked like a child wrapped in fur. The small, odd, canine face made it clear it wasn't a person. He said he ran out of the cave and saw the large wolf creature in the woods, the small one peering out from behind its leg. It screamed and threw a rock at my cousin's head. He said he dropped the other gun and ran. When we got back home, I told my husband that the neighborhood was dangerous and the house was in a bad condition, so we didn't want to stay. He didn't ask too much about it. I was thankful, and my cousin has avoided me like the plague for the last few months. My mom told me he's thinking of moving back to NC this year, and he mentioned to his mom that my grandparents' house was for sale. Hi everyone, it's me, Michelle Renee, but you're welcome to call me Giggles. Thank you so much for watching the video. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my patrons, Eric Cifuentes, Andrea Sanderson London, Lawrence Wallen, Geek Sanctuary, and Melissa Perez. If you want to become a patron today, I have links in the description, also for my Discord or even for my coffee if you just want to make a one-time donation. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you in the next video.